The airplane was packed that Tuesday morning, and flight attendant Grace Martinez had seen it all in her 15 years of working for the airline. Rich passengers who complained about everything, rude travelers who treated her like she was invisible, and anxious flyers who needed constant reassurance. But as she walked down the aisle of the Boeing 777 heading from New York to Los Angeles, something caught her attention that she'd never experienced before. In seat 3A sat a young woman who looked completely out of place in first class. While everyone else wore expensive suits and designer clothes, she had on a simple black blazer that had clearly been worn many times. Her shoes were polished but old, and her small purse looked like it had been carefully maintained for years. Grace had worked in first class long enough to spot the usual passengers, business executives, celebrities, and wealthy retirees who treated luxury travel like breathing. This woman was different. She sat quietly, looking around with wide eyes like she couldn't believe where she was. Grace wondered if maybe she'd gotten an upgrade or if someone had bought her the ticket. It happened sometimes, though not very often. "Excuse me," the woman said softly when Grace passed by her seat. Her voice was polite, almost hesitant. "I hope this doesn't sound strange, but I was wondering, do you ever have leftover meals from first class that would otherwise be thrown away?" Grace stopped walking and turned to look at her. In all her years of flying, she'd never heard anyone ask that question. Most first-class passengers barely touched their meals, leaving half-eaten plates that went straight into the trash. The question wasn't rude or demanding. It was asked with such careful politeness that Grace felt her heart skip a beat. "I'm sorry," the woman continued quickly, seeing Grace's surprised expression. "I know it's an unusual request. I just hate to see food wasted when so many people are hungry." There was something in her voice that made Grace pause. It wasn't just about the food. There was a deeper story here. The woman's hands were folded neatly in her lap, and Grace noticed they were the hands of someone who worked hard. Not rough exactly, but they showed signs of someone who didn't spend their days getting manicures. "What's your name, honey?" Grace asked gently. "Lisa," the woman replied. "Lisa Chen." Grace glanced around to make sure no other passengers needed anything, then leaned in closer. "You know what, Lisa? Let me see what I can do. We often do have extra meals, and you're absolutely right. It's terrible to waste food." Lisa's face lit up with genuine gratitude. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate your kindness." 3 rows behind Lisa in seat 1B sat someone who had overheard the entire conversation. Robert Williams was a tech entrepreneur worth over $200 million, and he was flying to Los Angeles for a business meeting that could potentially make him even richer. He'd been reading through financial reports on his tablet when Lisa's soft voice caught his attention. Robert had grown up in a small apartment in Detroit with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. His grandmother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and he remembered nights when they'd share a single can of soup for dinner. He remembered the careful way his grandmother would save leftovers, wrapping them in old containers and making them last for days. He recognized something in Lisa's voice, the sound of someone who knew what it meant to be truly hungry. As Grace walked back toward the galley, Robert found himself watching Lisa more carefully. She pulled out a worn laptop bag and set it on her lap, then took out a computer that had definitely seen better days. The laptop was covered in stickers from various coffee shops and had a crack running down one corner of the screen. But what caught Robert's attention was what she was working on. Even from 3 rows away, he could see architectural drawings on her screen. Detailed blueprints that looked professional and complex. Lisa worked with intense concentration, occasionally pulling out a small notebook to scribble calculations or notes. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, and Robert could tell she knew exactly what she was doing. 20 minutes later, Grace returned with a covered meal tray and a bottle of water. She approached Lisa's seat discreetly, not wanting to draw attention from other passengers. "Here you go, dear," Grace said quietly, handing Lisa the tray. This would have just been thrown away anyway. Lisa's eyes filled with tears for just a moment before she composed herself. "Thank you so much. This means more to you than you could possibly know." "Don't mention it," Grace replied with a warm smile. "Enjoy your meal." Robert watched as Lisa carefully opened the meal container. Instead of eating immediately like he expected, she examined everything on the plate: the salmon, vegetables, bread roll, and small dessert. Then she did something that broke Robert's heart and reminded him powerfully of his childhood. Lisa ate only half of the meal, then carefully wrapped the remaining food in the cloth napkin that came with the tray. She was saving it for later. Robert knew that behavior intimately. When food was scarce, you never knew when your next meal would come. You saved what you could, even if it meant eating cold salmon later. It was survival instinct, and seeing it in first class on an airplane was jarring and heartbreaking at the same time. Lisa ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. She didn't waste a single crumb of the bread roll, and she drank the water carefully, making it last. Robert found himself unable to focus on his financial reports. Instead, he was completely absorbed in watching this woman who was clearly struggling but maintaining her dignity. When Lisa's phone buzzed, she answered it quietly. Robert couldn't help but overhear parts of the conversation, and what he heard made his chest tighten with recognition. "Hi, Mom. Yes, I'm on the plane. No, I haven't found a new job yet, but I have some interviews lined up next week. I know the rent is due Friday. I'll figure something out. Please don't worry about me. Everything will be fine." The conversation continued for a few minutes, with Lisa reassuring someone, probably her mother, that she was okay and that things would work out. But Robert could hear the strain in her voice, the careful way she was trying to sound confident when she clearly wasn't feeling that way. After she hung up, Lisa stared out the airplane window for a long time. Robert watched her reflection in the glass and saw her take a deep breath, square her shoulders, and then return to her architectural drawings. Whatever challenges she was facing, she wasn't giving up. Robert found himself thinking about his own journey from poverty to wealth. The nights he'd stayed up coding while working 2 part-time jobs to pay for college. The times he'd lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches while building his first company. The people who had helped him along the way, sometimes with small acts of kindness that meant everything. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Robert made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of rushing off the plane like he usually did, he would wait. He wanted to see where Lisa went next, what her story really was. Something told him that this unexpected encounter on Flight 447 was going to change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. The seatbelt sign came on, and Grace's voice came over the intercom asking everyone to prepare for landing. Robert closed his financial reports and put away his tablet. For the first time in years, a business meeting wasn't the most important thing on his mind. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was 5.5 hours long, and Robert Williams found himself completely fascinated by the woman 3 rows ahead of him. After Lisa had carefully wrapped and saved half her meal, she'd returned to working on her laptop with the kind of focused intensity that Robert recognized in successful people. But there was something different about her concentration. It wasn't the desperate focus of someone trying to impress a boss or meet a deadline. It was the deep, thoughtful attention of someone who truly loved what they were doing. Robert had built 3 successful companies, and he'd learned to recognize genuine passion when he saw it. Lisa worked steadily for 2 hours without taking a break. Occasionally, she would pull out her small notebook and sketch something by hand, then return to her computer screen. Robert couldn't see all the details from his seat, but he caught glimpses of what looked like building plans, structural drawings, and detailed measurements. Whatever she was working on was complex and professional. During a brief moment when Lisa stood up to stretch, Robert got a clearer look at her laptop screen. What he saw made him lean forward in surprise. These weren't amateur drawings or student projects. Lisa was working on sophisticated architectural plans for what appeared to be a multi-story building. The drawings included electrical systems, plumbing layouts, and structural details that only a trained architect would know how to create. Robert had worked with plenty of architects during his real estate investments, and he could tell the difference between professional work and amateur attempts. Lisa's drawings were definitely professional grade. This made her situation even more puzzling. If she was a trained architect capable of this level of work, why was she asking for leftover airplane meals? As the flight continued, Lisa's phone rang several more times. Each conversation gave Robert more pieces to a puzzle that was becoming increasingly interesting and heartbreaking. The St. call seemed to be from a potential employer. Robert heard Lisa say things like, "Yes, I'm very interested in the position, and I understand the salary range, and when would you like to schedule the interview?" Her voice was professional and confident during this call, but Robert noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she talked. The second call was clearly personal. Lisa's voice became softer and more concerned. "Dad, how are you feeling today? Did you take your medication this morning?" I know, but the doctor said it's important. I should be home by tonight. I'll stop by the pharmacy and pick up your prescription refills." Robert found himself piecing together a story. Lisa was clearly dealing with a sick parent while looking for work. That explained the financial stress, but it didn't explain how someone with obvious professional skills had ended up in such a difficult situation. About halfway through the flight, turbulence started. The captain's voice came over the intercom asking everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. The airplane began bouncing and shaking, and Robert noticed several passengers looking nervous. In the row across from Lisa, a young mother was traveling alone with a little boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. When the turbulence started, the child began crying and clinging to his mother. The woman looked exhausted and overwhelmed, trying to comfort her son while dealing with her own obvious fear of flying. Without hesitation, Lisa turned around in her seat and began talking softly to the little boy. Robert couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but her voice was calm and soothing. She started playing a simple finger game that made the child giggle despite the airplane's movement. When the turbulence got worse, Lisa began telling what sounded like a story, using animated hand gestures that kept the boy completely entertained. Robert watched this interaction with growing admiration. Lisa was clearly dealing with her own stress. He could see her knuckles were white as she gripped her armrest during the worst of the turbulence. But she put aside her own fear to help a stranger's child. That kind of natural kindness and presence of mind wasn't something you could teach or fake. The grateful mother mouthed thank you to Lisa several times, and Robert could see the relief in her eyes as her son calmed down. Lisa just smiled and continued her story until the turbulence passed and the captain announced that it was safe to move around the cabin again. After the excitement died down, Lisa returned to her work, but Robert noticed she kept glancing over at the little boy to make sure he was still okay. When the flight attendants came around with drinks, Lisa quietly asked Grace if she could have an extra package of crackers. Robert assumed it was for herself until he saw her hand it to the young mother for her son. This small act of generosity hit Robert harder than anything else he'd witnessed. Lisa had accepted leftover food for herself because she needed it, but she was willing to give away what little she had to help someone else. Robert had met plenty of wealthy people who wouldn't think twice about helping themselves, but rarely extended that generosity to others. As they approached Los Angeles, Robert found himself making mental notes about everything he'd observed. Lisa was clearly educated and skilled. She was kind and generous despite her own difficulties. She was professional in her work calls but caring in her personal ones. She was dealing with what sounded like a sick parent in job interviews while maintaining grace under pressure. Most importantly, she hadn't complained once during the entire flight. Robert had flown with business executives who complained about everything: the temperature, the service, the Wi-Fi speed, the seat comfort. Lisa had asked for leftover food with dignity and had spent the entire flight either working productively or helping others. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant reminding him about his 3 p.m. meeting in Beverly Hills. The meeting was worth potentially $50 million, and 6 months ago, it would have been the only thing on his mind. But now he found himself hoping the meeting would end quickly, so he could figure out what Lisa's story really was. As the plane began its final descent, Robert made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed as a businessman. Instead of rushing off to his important meeting, he was going to follow Lisa and find out where she went next. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to his assistant. "Reschedule the 3 p.m. meeting. Something important has come up." His assistant immediately texted back, "Is everything okay? This meeting has been scheduled for months." Robert stared at his phone for a moment, then typed, "Everything's fine. I'll explain later. Just reschedule for tomorrow if possible." He had no idea why he was making this choice. Following a stranger through Los Angeles was completely out of character for him, but something about Lisa had sparked his curiosity in a way that he couldn't ignore. Maybe it reminded him of his own struggles years ago. Maybe it was simple human decency. Or maybe it was the businessman in him recognizing that truly good people were rare and valuable. As the wheels touched down at LAX, Robert was already planning his next move. He would keep his distance and be respectful, but he was determined to learn more about Lisa Chen and her story. Something told him this unexpected encounter was going to be more important than any business meeting he'd ever attended. The airplane taxied to the gate, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Robert watched as Lisa carefully packed her laptop, making sure the wrapped food was secure in her bag. She thanked Grace one more time as she prepared to leave the plane, and Robert could see that the flight attendant was genuinely touched by Lisa's gratitude. Whatever happened next, Robert knew his comfortable, predictable life was about to get very interesting. Robert Williams had followed plenty of business leads in his career, but he'd never followed a person through an airport before. As passengers filed off the plane at LAX, he kept Lisa in sight while trying to look casual. She walked slowly through the terminal, checking her phone occasionally and looking around like she was getting her bearings. Robert expected her to head toward the taxi stands or rental car area like most passengers. Instead, Lisa walked in the opposite direction, toward the signs that said public transportation. Robert had flown into LAX hundreds of times, but he'd never taken public transportation from the airport. His driver was probably already waiting in the pickup area, wondering where he was. Lisa stopped at an information booth and spoke with the attendant for several minutes. Robert stayed far enough away that he couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Lisa nodding and taking notes in her small notebook. When she finished, she walked toward what looked like a shuttle bus stop. Robert pulled out his phone and quickly Googled LAX public transportation. Within minutes, he learned about the bus system that connected the airport to various parts of Los Angeles. It was cheap, but it took much longer than driving. For someone like Lisa, who clearly needed to watch every dollar, it made perfect sense. A green bus marked Flyaway pulled up to the stop, and Lisa joined the small line of passengers waiting to board. Robert made a split-second decision that surprised even him. He texted his driver. Something came up. Go ahead and leave without me. Then he walked over and joined the line behind Lisa. The bus ride into downtown Los Angeles gave Robert his first real glimpse into a side of the city he rarely saw. While Lisa stared out the window, Robert found himself looking at neighborhoods and communities that existed far from his usual world of business meetings and expensive restaurants. The passengers on the bus were a mix of airport employees heading home from work, budget-conscious travelers, and people who simply couldn't afford other transportation options. Lisa got off the bus at a stop in East Los Angeles, a neighborhood Robert had driven through but never explored. The area showed signs of ongoing change. New coffee shops and art galleries mixed with older businesses that had clearly been there for decades. Some buildings showed fresh paint and renovation, while others looked like they needed significant repair. Robert waited until several other passengers had gotten off, then followed at a distance. Lisa walked with purpose now, like she knew exactly where she was going. She turned down a side street lined with small houses and apartment buildings. Many of the yards were carefully maintained despite the modest circumstances, with colorful flowers and vegetable gardens that showed pride in the community. After walking for about 10 minutes, Lisa stopped in front of a single-story building that had seen better days. A faded sign near the entrance read, East Side Community Center, serving the neighborhood since 1987. The building needed paint, and some of the windows had been repaired with tape, but the entrance was clean and welcoming. Robert positioned himself across the street behind a parked car where he could observe without being seen. Lisa didn't go inside immediately. Instead, she sat on a bench near the entrance and pulled out her wrapped airplane meal. She ate the cold salmon and vegetables slowly, checking her phone occasionally. Even from across the street, Robert could see that she was savoring every bite. After finishing her meal, Lisa checked her appearance in her phone's camera, smoothed her hair, and walked into the community center. Robert waited a few minutes, then crossed the street to get a better look at the building. Through a large window, he could see into what appeared to be a meeting room where Lisa was setting up folding chairs in a circle. A bulletin board near the entrance was covered with community announcements, job postings, and service offerings. Robert scanned the notices, and one in particular caught his attention. It was a simple flyer, printed on regular white paper. Free architecture consultation, every Tuesday 6 p.m. Lisa Chen, licensed architect. Housing issues, tenant rights, building code questions. All services provided at no cost. Robert read the notice 3 times, trying to process what he was seeing. Lisa wasn't just visiting the community center, she was volunteering there. She was providing professional architectural services for free to people who couldn't afford them. The pieces of her story were starting to come together in a way that both amazed and concerned him. A few minutes before 6 o'clock, people began arriving at the community center. Robert watched as a steady stream of individuals and families walked through the entrance. There was an elderly man using a walker, a young couple with a baby, a middle-aged woman who looked exhausted, and several other people who clearly belonged to the working-class community surrounding the center. Robert found a coffee shop across the street with a window view of the community center. He ordered a coffee and sat where he could continue observing while trying to look like a customer checking his email. Through the community center window, he could see Lisa greeting each person who arrived with genuine warmth and attention. Around 7 o'clock, a woman emerged from the community center and approached Robert's table in the coffee shop. She was in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I noticed you watching our community center. Are you a reporter or something?" Robert felt his face flush with embarrassment at being caught. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to seem suspicious. I'm just curious about the programs you offer there." The woman smiled and sat down across from him without being invited. "I'm Carmen Rodriguez. I've been coming to Lisa's architecture consultations for 3 months now. That young woman has saved my family from losing our apartment." "Really?" Robert asked, genuinely interested. "How did she do that?" Carmen's face lit up with gratitude. "Our landlord was trying to evict us, claiming our apartment had building code violations that made it unsafe. He wanted us out so he could renovate and charge higher rent. But Lisa came to our apartment, took measurements, checked everything, and found out the landlord was lying. She even came to court with us and testified about the building codes. The judge ruled in our favor." "That's incredible," Robert said. "And she didn't charge you anything?" "Not a penny," Carmen replied. "She says everyone deserves safe, affordable housing, and that architects have a responsibility to use their knowledge to help people, not just make money for rich developers. She's helped dozens of families in our neighborhood." Carmen went on to explain that Lisa had been volunteering at the community center for several months, offering her expertise to people dealing with housing issues, predatory landlords, and building safety concerns. She'd helped families understand their rights, documented illegal building conditions, and even designed modifications for disabled residents who needed their homes to be more accessible. "The thing about Lisa," Carmen continued, "is that she treats everyone with respect, no matter how poor they are or how little education they have. She explains everything in simple terms, and she never makes anyone feel stupid for not understanding building codes or tenant laws." As Carmen talked, Robert found himself even more impressed with Lisa than he'd been on the airplane. Here was someone who was clearly struggling financially, but was dedicating her free time to helping others who were even worse off than she was. It was the kind of genuine community service that Robert rarely encountered in his business world. "Is she looking for work?" Robert asked carefully. Carmen's expression became sad. "Oh yes, she's been looking for months. She was laid off from some big architecture firm downtown. It's been hard for her. I can tell she's worried about money, though she never complains. She just keeps helping people and staying positive." Around 8:30, people began leaving the community center, and Robert could see Lisa cleaning up the meeting room. Carmen gathered her purse and prepared to leave the coffee shop. "If you're thinking about supporting our community center," she said to Robert, "we could really use help. Lisa donates her time, but she can't keep doing this forever if she can't find paid work. It would be a real loss for our neighborhood." After Carmen left, Robert remained in the coffee shop, watching as Lisa locked up the community center and began walking back toward the bus stop. For the first time in years, Robert found himself thinking about purpose and meaning rather than profit and success. He pulled out his phone and started researching Lisa Chen, architect. What he was about to discover would convince him that this chance encounter on Flight 447 was going to change both their lives forever. Robert Williams spent the entire night in his Beverly Hills hotel room researching Lisa Chen. What started as simple curiosity had become something much deeper. By 3 in the morning, he had built a complete picture of someone whose story challenged everything. He thought he knew about success, failure, and the value of a person's character. Lisa Chen had graduated from the University of Southern California with a master's degree in architecture And not just any graduation. She had finished at the top of her class with highest honors. Her senior thesis project had been featured in Architectural Review magazine, focusing on sustainable, affordable housing design for urban communities. Even as a student, she had been thinking about how architecture could serve people who usually couldn't afford good design. After graduation, Lisa had been hired by Morrison & Associates, one of Los Angeles's most prestigious architecture firms. For 3 years, she had worked on high-end commercial projects and luxury residential developments. Her online portfolio showed beautiful, innovative designs for office buildings, upscale shopping centers, and million-dollar homes in Beverly Hills and Malibu. But 6 months ago, Morrison & Associates had lost several major clients due to economic uncertainty. The firm had been forced to lay off nearly half their staff, and Lisa had been among those let go. Despite her talent and experience, the job market for architects had been brutal. Many firms were hiring only senior architects with decades of experience, while others had frozen their hiring entirely. Robert dug deeper into Lisa's background and found something that made his chest tighten with recognition. Lisa's father had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease 2 years ago, at the age of 58. Her mother worked as a teacher's aide, making barely enough to cover their basic expenses. Lisa had been helping support her parents financially, while also paying her own student loans and living expenses. The more Robert learned, the more he realized that Lisa's current situation wasn't the result of poor choices or lack of ability. She was caught in a perfect storm of circumstances, a difficult job market, family responsibilities, and the kind of economic pressures that could crush even the most capable person. But what impressed Robert most was what Lisa had done with her unemployment. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or focusing solely on finding another high-paying job, she had started volunteering at the East Side Community Center. Robert found records of her work there that went far beyond simple consultation. Lisa had helped prevent 4 families from being evicted by documenting building code violations and illegal rent increases. She had designed wheelchair-accessible modifications for 3 elderly residents, working with local contractors to implement the changes at cost. She had created plans for a community garden that transformed an empty lot into a gathering space where neighbors could grow vegetables and children could play safely. Most impressive of all, Lisa had been teaching basic architectural principles to high school students who couldn't afford college preparation courses. She volunteered every Saturday morning, helping teenagers understand math and science concepts through hands-on design projects. Several of her students had already been accepted to college programs in engineering and architecture. Robert found newspaper articles about Lisa's community work. The local paper had featured her in a story about volunteer heroes, highlighting how she had helped a disabled veteran modify his apartment so he could live independently. The veteran, Carlos Martinez, had lost his left leg in Afghanistan and was struggling to navigate his small apartment with crutches and a wheelchair. Lisa had spent weeks measuring Carlos's apartment, researching accessibility requirements and creating detailed modification plans. She had then worked with local contractors to install grab bars, widen doorways, and create a roll-in shower. The project had cost less than $3,000, but it had given Carlos his dignity and independence back. She didn't just draw up plans and leave, Carlos had told the newspaper reporter. She was there every day during the installation, making sure everything was done right. She explained why each modification was important and even taught me how to maintain everything. She treated me like family, not like a charity case. Reading these stories, Robert began to understand that Lisa's request for leftover airplane food wasn't about personal desperation. It was about resource management. She was directing every available dollar toward helping others and supporting her family, leaving little for herself. Her choice to save half the airline meal wasn't poverty. It was sacrifice with purpose. Robert's phone rang at 6 a.m. It was his business partner calling from New York about the meeting Robert had canceled the day before. "Rob, what's going on?" his partner asked. "The investors were expecting to meet with you yesterday. This deal could be worth $50 million to us." "I know," Robert replied, surprising himself with how calm he felt. "I'll call them later today and reschedule." Something more important came up. "More important than $50 million? Are you feeling okay?" Robert looked out his hotel window at the Los Angeles skyline as the sun began to rise. I'm feeling better than I have in years, actually. I think I've found something worth investing in. After hanging up, Robert continued his research. He discovered that Lisa had been quietly approached by several community organizations about her volunteer work. The Los Angeles Housing Authority had asked her to consult on affordable housing projects. A nonprofit organization focused on veterans issues had requested her help designing accessible housing units. Even USC, her alma mater, had inquired about her availability to teach part-time classes, but Lisa had turned down most of these opportunities because they conflicted with her volunteer schedule at the Eastside Community Center or because they didn't pay enough to justify taking time away from job searching. She was caught in an impossible situation, too busy helping others for free to pursue paid work, but too financially pressed to continue helping others much longer. Robert spent the morning visiting the community center again, this time going inside and speaking with the director, a woman named Patricia Williams who had been running the center for 15 years. Lisa is the best thing that's happened to our community in decades, Patricia told him. But I'm worried about her. She's been skipping meals and I can tell she's under enormous stress. She won't accept any help from us. She says we need our resources for families who are worse off than she is. Patricia went on to explain that Lisa had been working on a comprehensive plan to address housing issues throughout East Los Angeles. She had identified properties that could be renovated into affordable housing, documented which landlords were violating building codes, and created designs for community spaces that could serve multiple neighborhoods. She's got a vision for how this whole area could be improved without displacing the families who have lived here for generations, Patricia said. But she needs resources and support to make it happen. Right now, she's doing everything on her own time with her own money. By noon, Robert had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. He was going to offer Lisa Chen something that would change both their lives. Not just a job, but a partnership in a venture that could transform communities across the country. But first, he had to figure out how to approach her without seeming like a crazy person who had followed her from an airplane. Robert Williams had closed multi-million-dollar deals with Fortune 500 companies, but he had never been more nervous about a business meeting in his life. The most important conversation of his career was about to begin, and it had started with a simple request for leftover food on Flight 447. Robert Williams had negotiated billion-dollar deals, but he'd never been more nervous about a conversation in his life. After 2 days of research and planning, he had positioned himself at the same coffee shop across from the Eastside Community Center, waiting for Lisa to arrive for her Tuesday evening volunteer session. His approach had to be perfect. He couldn't reveal that he'd followed her from the airplane. That would seem stalkerish and probably scare her away. He couldn't lead with his wealth because that might make her suspicious of his motives. Instead, he had crafted a story that was truthful but carefully edited. He was a businessman interested in community development projects, and he'd heard about the excellent work being done at the center. At 5:45 p.m., Lisa walked past the coffee shop window, carrying her worn laptop bag and looking tired but determined. Robert waited 10 minutes, then walked across the street and entered the community center. Inside, he found Lisa setting up chairs in the familiar meeting room while reviewing notes on her phone. "Excuse me," Robert said politely. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Robert Williams, and I'm interested in learning about the architecture consultations that happen here." Lisa looked up with a professional smile that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "Of course. I'm Lisa Chen. Are you looking for help with a housing issue, or are you interested in supporting our program somehow?" "Actually, a bit of both," Robert replied, pulling out a business card that identified him simply as Robert Williams, community development consultant. It wasn't technically a lie. He was about to become very interested in community development. Lisa examined the card with interest. "What kind of community development work do you do?" "I work with investors who are interested in affordable housing projects and community revitalization," Robert said carefully. "I've been researching successful programs in Los Angeles, and your work here has come up in several conversations. I'd love to learn more about your approach." For the next hour, as community members arrived for their consultations, Robert observed Lisa in action. He watched her help an elderly couple understand their rights when their landlord was threatening eviction over medical equipment that supposedly violated their lease. He saw her create detailed sketches showing a young mother how to make her apartment safer for her toddler without violating building codes. He listened as she explained complex legal concepts in simple terms that everyone could understand. What struck Robert most was Lisa's genuine care for each person who sought her help. She didn't just answer their questions. She made sure they understood why the answers mattered and how to protect themselves in the future. She treated every consultation like it was the most important appointment of her day. After the last consultation ended at 8:30, Robert approached Lisa as she was packing up her materials. "That was incredible to watch," he said sincerely. "The way you connect with people and explain complex topics so clearly, that's a rare gift." Lisa smiled, and for the first time that evening, the smile reached her eyes. "Thank you. These are good people who deserve to have safe, affordable places to live. Sometimes they just need someone to help them understand their options." "Can I buy you dinner?" Robert asked. "I'd love to hear more about your vision for community development, and I might have some opportunities that would interest you." Lisa hesitated. Robert could see her mental calculation. She was probably hungry, but she was also cautious about business meetings with strangers, especially ones that might be too good to be true. "There's a little restaurant 2 blocks from here," she said finally. "Nothing fancy, but they have good food and we can talk without disturbing anyone." The restaurant Lisa chose was a small, family-owned Mexican place with plastic chairs and handwritten menus. It was exactly the kind of authentic, affordable place that Robert never went to anymore, but had loved when he was young and poor. Lisa ordered carefully, choosing one of the less expensive items, and Robert found himself remembering his grandmother doing the same thing when money was tight. "So tell me about your background," Robert said after they'd ordered. "How did you end up doing community architecture work?" Lisa's story unfolded over dinner, and even though Robert already knew most of the details from his research, hearing it directly from her was different. She spoke about her parents with love and concern, especially her father's declining health. She described her work at Morrison and Associates with enthusiasm for the projects, but frustration with how architecture was often used only to serve the wealthy. "Got into architecture because I wanted to design buildings that would make people's lives better," Lisa said, her voice growing more passionate. "But most of what I did was making rich people's houses more luxurious, while families like the ones I grew up with were struggling to find safe, affordable places to live." "What would you do differently if you had the resources?" Robert asked. Lisa's eyes lit up with excitement. "I've been working on a comprehensive plan for East Los Angeles. There are dozens of buildings that could be converted into affordable housing units with the right investment and design. I've identified properties where we could create mixed-income communities, places where teachers, nurses, and working families could afford to live without being pushed out of their own neighborhoods." She pulled out her phone and showed Robert photos and sketches of buildings she'd been studying. Her vision was detailed and thoughtful, considering everything from transportation access to community spaces to environmental sustainability. "The key is community input," Lisa continued. "Too many affordable housing projects are designed by people who've never lived in the communities they're supposed to serve. Residents know what they need better than any architect sitting in a downtown office." Robert listened, occasionally asking questions that revealed his business background. Lisa seemed impressed by his understanding of financing and development challenges, though she didn't probe too deeply into his experience. As they talked, Robert found himself more and more convinced that Lisa was exactly the partner he'd been looking for without knowing it. For months, he'd been considering how to use his wealth for something more meaningful than just making more money. He'd looked into various charitable foundations and social impact investments, but nothing had felt quite right. Lisa represented something different. She had the professional skills to execute complex projects, the community connections to ensure they served real needs, and the personal integrity to make sure resources were used wisely. Most importantly, she had the vision to create lasting change rather than just temporary solutions. "Lisa," Robert said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I had access to significant funding for the kind of projects you're describing?" Lisa looked at him skeptically. "I'd say that sounds too good to be true, and I'd want to know what the catch was." Robert laughed, appreciating her directness. "Fair enough. Here's the truth. I'm not just a community development consultant. I'm a tech entrepreneur, and I've been very fortunate financially. I've been looking for ways to invest in projects that could create real social impact. And everything you've described aligns perfectly with what I've been hoping to find. He pulled out his real business card and slid it across the table. Lisa picked it up and her eyes widened as she recognized the name of his company. "You're serious," she said. Not quite a question. Completely serious. "I'd like to offer you something, but I want you to take time to think about it before you answer." Robert outlined his proposal, a partnership to create a new company focused on affordable housing development and community-centered design. Lisa would be the lead architect and community liaison, with equity ownership in the company and complete creative control over projects. The initial funding would be $50 million, with the potential for much more as they prove the concept. "The catch," Robert continued, "is that this isn't charity. I believe we can create profitable businesses while serving communities that have been neglected by traditional developers. You'd be taking a risk on an unproven model with someone you just met." Lisa stared at the business card, then looked up at Robert with an expression he couldn't read. "Why me? You could partner with any established architect in the city. Because in one evening, I've watched you demonstrate more genuine care for people and more practical wisdom about community needs than most professionals show in their entire careers. And because I have a feeling that together we could build something that neither of us could create alone." Lisa was quiet for a long time, turning the business card over in her hands. Finally, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Did you follow me from the airplane yesterday?" Robert felt his face flush red. He'd been caught, and now everything depended on his response. "Yes," he said simply. "I overheard your conversation with the flight attendant, and something about your dignity and kindness stayed with me. I wanted to understand your story." Instead of anger, Lisa's face showed something like relief. "I thought I recognized you from the plane, but I convinced myself I was imagining it." "Why didn't you just introduce yourself then?" "Because I wanted to know who you really were, not who you might pretend to be if you knew I had money." "I'm sorry if that seems manipulative. It wasn't meant that way." Lisa smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Actually, it makes me trust you more. Anyone can fake being nice for an hour. It takes real character to spend 2 days researching someone before offering them a life-changing opportunity." 3 months later, Lisa Chen was featured on the front page of the Los Angeles Times as the architect transforming affordable housing. The article described the groundbreaking community development project she was leading through her partnership with Williams Development Group. But the detail that made Robert proudest was buried in the middle of the article. Lisa had insisted that Grace Martinez, the flight attendant who had shared the leftover meal, be invited to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for their first completed project, because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes in the world. The airplane meal that had started everything was just the beginning of a story that would transform not just 2 lives, but entire communities across the country.